Okay, brethren, some of the ground rules for tonight are that the panel will occur first, then participants can join in with any questions or comments. We will limit everyone to 1 or 2 statements so that we can get as many participants as possible. This is not a tiled lodge, so please govern yourself accordingly. Nothing that's in cipher should be announced on Zoom tonight. Everyone will be on mute except for the panel.
It's my honor to introduce our 2 panel participants tonight. The first is Right Worshipful Clifford Jacobs, 33rd degree. Cliff was raised a Master Mason of June of 1988. He was appointed an Assistant Grand Lecturer of the 4th Manhattan District in 2004. He is a member of the Royal Arch Masons, member of the Cryptic Masons, member of the Knights Templar, as well as a member of the Scottish Rite, where he received his 33rd and last degree of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite for the North of Freemasonry for the Northern Masonic jurisdiction in 2008. He was recognized in 1995 with the Chancellor R. Livingston Award for creating and producing the cable series Masons in Action. Our other participant is Right Worshipful Walter Cook, who has been a trustee of the Chancellor Robert R. Livingston Masonic Library of the Grand Lodge of the State of New York for 4 years, as a Mason for 10 years, and a practitioner of the Western Mysteries for over 2 decades. When not serving our craft via presentations or ritual, he is one of the hosts of Magic for the Many. Thank you to both of our participants for being on the panel tonight. So Brother Michael LaRocco, we picked Morals and Dogma, Entered Apprentice, because it's one of those books that everybody has seen. It's probably on many people's bookshelves, but they probably haven't read it. Or when they have tried to read it, they've read the first 2 paragraphs and said, I have no idea what he's talking about, and they close the book. So we thought that it would be an interesting discussion to focus in on the Entered Apprentice degree and to see what we could come up with as a panel of what we could take away with it. Brother Pike was active in the Scottish Rite in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and he wrote Morals and Dogma in 1871 is when that comes to us. And it's been a very popular book, published and was part of many Scottish Rite Masons libraries for many years. So with that, Brother LaRocco, if you want to start us off with the discussion.
Yes, Mark Isaacs, who was a panelist in our last reading room, said that he's been reading Pike's Moral and Dogmas for 20 years, and he's on page 3 right now. So, yeah, Right Worshipful Bill, you were talking about how this concept of force was being discussed. And so I just want to read the passage that came out to me. It's also, again, a difficult read. The force must have a brain and a law. Then it leads to a daring produce permanent results, and there is real progress. And then there are sublime conquests. Thought is a force, and philosophy should be an energy finding its aim and its effects in the amelioration of mankind. The 2 great motives are truth and love. When all these forces are combined and guided by the intellect and regulated by the rule of right and justice of the combined and systematic movement and effort, the great revolution prepared by the ages will begin to march. The power of the deity himself is in equilibrium with his wisdom, hence only results harmony. So it's really interesting how he talked about it. Now that the subtopic again is the Entered Apprentice, how it's about forming force and how to develop it and create harmony. So that's how I'd like to start tonight's discussion. And if Walter or Cliff would like to chime in, or and I want to ask them what was the effect of hearing that, or your opinion on that.
Well, if I can jump in first, my immediate impression was it's amazing that this is what they lay at the feet of someone that has just joined the craft, because even the first few paragraphs are awfully heady compared to what most people would willingly encounter in today's world, even if they have an interest in looking at magazines of whatever stripe. So I have to wonder what the drift of time has done to our culture in the century and change between then and now.
That's a great point, Walter. My first encounter when I was thinking about joining Masonry, people were citing that some of the problems in Pike, the 3 times it's mentioned that he seems to glorify Lucifer. And so I don't think Pike meant for this to be given out to everybody. I think they mass produced it and gave it out to everybody. I don't think that was his intention. I don't know what his intention is, obviously, but I think that it just ought to be a great idea if they just gave the book out to anybody. Seems like the people who persecute Masonry read it more than Masons read it.
Well, you have to find your target somehow.
Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that is that Masonry takes a good man and makes them better. And if this is done in conjunction, before, probably not during, or after Pike's first degree, they've barely dipped their toe into the water, and they're confronted with a lot of heady ideas. He spoke at length in the chapter about the notion of politics, and I know that it's not something that we really like to discuss, but in sort of a non-partisan abstract notion, he seems to be very concerned with the passionate force that can arise not only in the individual, but in groups of people, and confronting the reader with the danger of groupthink, before that term was coined.
I think that Pike was trying to seek truth and looking at moral, religious, political, and governmental philosophy. So he's taken it in a different vein than I would have. So when he was talking about force, in my reflection on it, I'm still thinking in terms of self-improvement and the idea that if something, if you think of a laser, right, or if you're going to break off the corner of rough stones, you need very focused force for that to happen. And when I read those first few opening sentences, I was like, oh, that's where he was going with it. And then he quickly turned to making it more of a political observation about society. And that seems to be his themes throughout, versus it being what at least I typically think of it as a personal improvement of the individual.
I was a little surprised. I think back to, I believe it's the charge of the third degree, where we tell the candidate that each of the degrees has its paramount duty, and the entered apprentice duty is to God. And it seems that Pike spends little or no time discussing that relationship in terms of the entered apprentice. And I was a little puzzled as to why he brought in, the political discussion, as opposed to talking more about the relationship of the individual brother, in this case, an entered apprentice, to God. Pike is, he's interesting to read, but I think, I don't know, what kind of audience he's writing for. And I don't know that I would give this chapter to an entered apprentice to read or study upon being brought into the craft, because I think it goes far afield as to what the entered apprentice degree is really all about.
Well, he was writing for an entirely different audience. Years ago, when I was writing a paper on chambers of reflection, I looked at his treatments of the first through third degrees. And there's some real bombast there. Like you're dealing with some of the more sensational images that people think and hear about when they hear Masonry, when they're not familiar with the way that it's practiced today. So lots of skulls and skeletons, and warnings of a mortal sort against betraying your word. It was really high energy sort of experience back then. Nowadays, we can't get away with that sort of thing. We've become entirely too concerned with litigation. I don't know if that was something that he had to worry about back then, because he certainly wrote powerful rituals, but I don't think that we can get away with them today.
Also, he seemed to be very satirical about regular Masons and tried to separate or delineate between Masons that get into the Scottish Rite, to get into the much more deeper. And he was, what's the term that he used, Right Worshipful Bill? York Rite Brethren, or?
Yes, throughout, I think there were 7 references, and I'll say it specifically, I have it marked here. Just give me 1 second. He said, we shall not repeat the explanations of the symbols given by the York Rite, or he'll say our York Rite brethren, but then he went through and then he'll say, but a continuation of the same superficial interpretation. So he often seems to imply that he's found a deeper, truer meaning than what is in our ritual as coming from the York Rite tradition.
Which is what we practice in most of the jurisdictions in the United States.
Yeah. Anyone have a reaction to that in the panel?
Well,
Well,
I just a quick, response. It's interesting because I just received from the Scottish Rite Research Society a book about the 3 degrees, the symbolic degrees, as they were part of the Scottish Rite. Apparently, the York Rite and the Scottish Rite had their own versions of the first 3 degrees before they became part of Grand Lodge. We seem to have relinquished that to Grand Lodges, and the first 3 degrees are pretty uniform, but at one time it seems like there were 2 different versions of the first 3 degrees, one tailored particularly to the York Rite and another set tailored particularly to the Scottish Rite. And I think such as when he in this chapter, when he talks about, the York Rite of Scottish Rite, I believe that's what he's referring to.
Yes, they have their roots more in the French tradition. That I've looked at some of that, so that the degrees when they came over, as the Scottish Rite rituals what became the Scottish Rite rituals, they came from France to Santo Domingo, and then from there up to South Carolina and so forth. There is the 10th Manhattan District, which practices a variant of this in the first degree. So some things that are in the Pike's first degree, you'll find in the 10th Manhattan District, as well as in Louisiana. There's some lodges there that practice this with some of the different flair of things. And then there's a lodge in Hawaii as well, and I believe Washington, D.C. So there's threads of it, spots of it throughout North America.
Probably the most popular or popularized version that you could see is if you see Garibaldi's first degree. If you ever come to Grand Lodge and see Garibaldi's first degree. It was actually going through the history of New York Grand Lodge and the schisms. There was a little known, it was a Supreme Council and a Grand Lodge that were connected. I'm not sure they were separate. They were called different things, but it was called the Atwood Grand Lodge or the Atwood Supreme Council. They started actually chartering some lodges. And the lodges that they chartered, they got that charter from Louisiana. The Grand Lodge in Louisiana, there's, I think, 4. One of them, Blue Lodge, is 1 through 32. They do all 32 degrees. To them, it's not separate. It's one rite. And it was interesting. So they got busted after a while for chartering lodges in not that territory. So that went away eventually. But interesting part of history.
Is there anything that the panelists either strongly agreed with what Pike said or strongly disagreed with Pike? Have any reactions that way in reading it?
Well, he put forward a ton of ideas, and I wouldn't say so much that they came across as opinion in the way that I'd be able to easily say, well, here you're correct, but I'm going to parse this apart and say yay or nay. There's a gulf of time in between when he was writing this and now. For example, just the length of sentences and paragraphs. When I was reading things from that point in time and going through grad school, my professors yelled at me because I was emulating that writing style, saying like, you have too many comma splices and you need to fix this. So I wouldn't say that I want to agree or disagree with Pike, especially success being proof. What would I be able to say to him as someone that has had such an effect on Masonry throughout the world? The things that I found, and I know I mentioned this before, but I was hoping that I could get more of bounce back from the hosts and my fellow panelists, is who is the sort of Mason that he was writing it for? Because clearly he assumes that the reader has already gone through the York Rite degrees. So to echo your point from earlier, Michael, this isn't specifically for an Entered Apprentice. And also, when he's talking about the York Rite degrees and calling things, at least the symbol set, superficial, he's expecting that they have a hunger for digging deeper into something. But at the same time, he deliberately stops himself on occasion from going too deep into the Entered Apprentice degree. It seems like he wants to keep something at least as accessible as politics. What I did note, and I kept thinking about, and it seems so odd, is that almost out of nowhere, he starts talking about the 7 planets. In the immediately preceding paragraph, he starts talking about the dimensions of the lodge and has a segue sort of loose in that the dimensions of the lodge are supposed to be, as large as heaven. And then talks about the 7 planets and reaches back into the ancient past and describes that, they had planetary deities that they looked after. And this is how we ended up with days of the week. And there were ladder or steps on a ladder that ascended to heaven, which is sort of echoed with Jacob's ladder, but was also present in Mithraic religions. So it stuck out to me because it doesn't seem to connect directly to anything else that was in this chapter. And I was trying to not go too far afield by reading ensuing chapters. So I'm wondering why he felt that an embellishment on the planets was necessary for this without digging too deeply into it. It seems like he wouldn't mention it for no reason, because throughout Western esoterica, the planets are big, powerful ideas at the very least. But to throw them out there and then stop was very curious to me. Cliff, do you have any thoughts as to why you would do that?
I don't know why he went down that particular road. I'm hard pressed to come up with a reason for that, except for maybe the significance of the number 7 in a lot of what we do. He mentioned the Jacob's ladder, and that while we have 3 rungs of faith, hope, and charity, if you add the prudence, fortitude, justice, and so forth, then you get up to 7. But and then I know, I'm not sure if Pike said this, but sometimes Jacob's ladder has 72 rungs, and that gets into something else, like the Shemham Foresh,
right?
This 72 names of God. So I thought maybe he was just leaving breadcrumbs for the reader to follow, to kind of go deeper on one's own. Other than that, I can't really say. I think he's, he might be a little bit of the trickster in his writing as well.
Well, that's what I was wondering about, because I think right before he mentions the planets, he discusses the lesser light. So I'm going to skirt around the topic to not, quote something from the ritual. But there are 2 planets that we discuss in even the Entered Apprentice degree. And there's a 3rd lesser light that seems to be sort of the earthly representative of that. So the question would be then, the notion of light, as we speak about it Masonically, as being sort of a insight, understanding, or interior illumination, but balanced against the notion of physical light as seen in the sky. So, I mean, I suppose that, there may be an element of the trickster. I saw someone in chat saying that it was a teaser. That could be.
I get that impression of Pike too. I always wonder, there are certain things, especially when it comes to how it's played out in some of the southern jurisdictions' degrees of the Scottish Rite. I always wondered where there was a few things that he got wrong, yet he had to teach himself Sanskrit in order to read the Bhagavad Gita. So there's a couple of things he got wrong, but I mean, we take for granted what he had to go through to find this information, decipher it, and really discover the teachings of other religions. And I always wondered that some of the things that he got wrong, or I dare say maybe changed from the original Franken manuscript to his degrees, is it that he just made a mistake because he was trying to fill in the gaps? Did he intentionally create a ruse for brothers to catch the mistakes and then go back and do their own research and have their own discovery? I kind of want to romanticize him and say it's the latter. That he's kind of like maybe like what you and Cliff was saying. That he's kind of like this is creating like a whole bunch of fuzzy information, and that you have to be worthy enough to go deeper. And so
there may be a third option, though. It may be something like lust of result. So in the book of Numbers, I think that he, I don't know if authored would be the right term, but sort of condensed. He puts forward a explanation for a part of the third degree being revealed in the famous Aum. Like, you can't go to a yoga class today without having, like, my 5-year-old literally was taught to, say Aum as a way of calming herself at the beginning and the end of doing yoga. And that ended up being specious. And at the introduction of the book, it says that, well, historically, we can't say that this was even in mind of the designers of the ritual. So we have to disavow his conclusion here. Nevertheless, it stays in the book. So I think that he might be an individual that had so many bolts of lightning, inspiration going on through his Masonic experience, and was able to connect a lot of dots. But sometimes he may have let the idea of what has come across to him escape him. Sometimes we call this personal and verified gnosis, which is something deeply meaningful to the individual, but isn't always translatable to the next brother.
and then he'll say something like profound, like there was this one part that I highlighted. Though masonry neither usurps the place of nor apes religion, prayer is an essential part of our ceremonies. It is the aspiration of the soul towards the absolute and infinite intelligence, which is the one supreme deity, most feebly and misunderstandably characterized as an architect. Certain faculties of man are directed towards the unknown, thought, meditation, prayer. The unknown is an ocean, of which conscience is the compass. Thought, meditation, prayer are the great mysteries pointing of the needle. It is a spiritual magnetism that thus connects the human soul with the deity. These majestic iridations of the soul pierce through the shadow toward the light.
So evocative, isn't it?
Indeed.
And Brother Michael, from our conversation, I did look up what apes means in that context, and it probably means imitate. So it'd be that masonry doesn't imitate or usurp a religion, but then it has this lofty purpose. So that's how I would interpret that.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah, I had a note here about that passage that you quoted, Michael, and that I really appreciate Pike's approach to the unknown, because we are all finite beings, and the totality of the universe, which is truth, is unknowable to us. We are just not capable of grasping it. The idea of Laplace's demon, where even if we could memorize the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, we still wouldn't be able to do much with that beyond a few lengths of time, even in a human lifetime, because we wouldn't be able to process, even if we had that chunk of information, what it would all mean. Irrespective of physics like Brownian motion, but the choices that people make and the movements that go through society or an individual, like he talks about earlier in the chapter about force. There are things that move through people that seem to come from deep within them, that in some ways we can sort of control, at least have self-control, but in other ways we kind of have to surf a wave. I think that we've all been feeling this since politics started to heat up less than 10 years ago. So yeah, the notion of unknown keeps us humble, and reminds us that even calling deity an architect is not altogether accurate. So the humility in that spoke to me.
Did anyone catch where the part where he almost is like saying, of course he takes like 50 times more words to say something than the average person. But it's almost like there's this one part where he's saying that prayer actually can control the forces of nature with the will, with free will. Did anybody catch that part of it?
Yeah. What would you like to say about it?
I'd like to hear your opinion on it.
Well,
Either on what he said or the subject itself.
within the subject of masonry and religion, I think what he's talking about the power of prayer and the appeal of the deeper parts of the human entity to reach out beyond its physical capacities to affect that force. And I'm not trying to go into a George Lucas direction. He does say that thought and emotion are forces to contend with. They're not impotent just because they're not physical. The means by which they can affect the world is unknown to us now, because we're so used to a controlled environment with one variable being changeable. And as soon as you step into the realm of psychology, that becomes impossible. Like, are you stressed today? Do you have something else on your mind that's distracting you? Do you have something that's unconscious that is affecting you in a way that you don't know? Yeah, he gets real close to writing The Secret there. That has entered and exited pop culture already. I would say that esoteric practice that he's kind of hinting at says, yeah, there are means by which that thought and emotion can affect the physical world, but it's not as easy as just writing down a vision board.
Now, when you say secret, you're referring to the movie and the book, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Like I said, I'm not really. I can't call myself a fan, nor am I a critic of Albert Pike. And we noted so many of the problems with reading him. But then he comes up with this line. He says, "To deny the efficacy of prayer is to deny that of faith, love, and effort. Yet the effects produced when our hand, moved by our will, launches a pebble into the ocean, never cease, and every uttered word is registered for eternity upon the invisible air." Wow.
Yeah.
That's profound.
Yeah, I happen to agree with him on that point. I think prayer is very efficacious, and the power of prayer is the way of the mystic, as opposed to, say, the way of a practical magician. A lot of prayers have their own sort of egregor that have been built up over years, like the Lord's Prayer, for example, and they can be and are very, very powerful. I think Pike got that one right, actually, and yeah, I agree with him totally on that point.
And it reminds me of the notion of something like apostolic succession too, because think about what we do when we are going through our ceremonies, when we induct someone into the fraternity. There's one of my books that calls it something like spiritual cooties, where you can only be made a Mason by another Mason. You can't do it on your own. Even if you were to like fashion all of the furniture in the lodge perfectly, the experience of it is to be in a temple with a lodge of brothers inside the temple welcoming you into the fraternity. And that is accomplished by the same means as, prayer and faith. It's there's thought and emotion and a sort of poetic, I'm going to struggle with the word, sort of vamping up of the personality. We open ourselves to something greater at those moments in time.
Yeah, that's powerful. I was taking a good friend of mine through the proficiency, right, from first degree to second degree. And when he looked at the book, he was like, "Oh, this is like Hebrew." I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, when you learn Hebrew, you need a rabbi to tell you what the words are. Someone has to tell you that MR period means Mr. or DRD means doctor. You'll never guess it. You'll never know." And so the ritual itself needs another person to fill in the gaps. And so I guess it gets to where we started with the first degree, with the scripture lesson. Oh, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell in unity, and the whole lecture of the tools. How it ends with the common gavel, and how that whole speech ends is profound.
Mm. Yeah, my experience of the first degree was literally life-changing. I joined the fraternity expecting that it was going to be just a cool little thing that I could do to plug myself into something that my father and my grandfather had done. And even after meditating for like 10 years and change, I was floored by the power and the sublime technique that goes into the ritual. And that's regardless of whether or not the people performing it appreciate what it is that they're doing. Like what Masonry has is nothing less than the most powerful and profound technology for human transformation I've ever seen. Like every fraternal organization that I know of, even the one that my wife's belonged to, like a fraternal order of pharmacists, they stole from us.
And yet, my first degree, my first experience, the master stuttered. I didn't understand a word he said. So thank God that I was able to go back and see first degrees after that over and over, and they confer it myself and be part of it myself. And sometimes you get it when you first receive it, and even if you get a crappy display of it, there's still hope. There's definitely still hope.
Well, that was the course that came through, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, and Brother Walter, you mentioned something. You used an interesting phrase. I think you mentioned apostolic succession, and you know, I think that's something that sometimes in Masonry we don't understand or we miss, because it is a transmission. You are transmitting something to the candidate that has a long history, and when the master or whoever is conferring the degree understands that, I think the moment can be very intense for the one who is actually receiving the degree. It's a succession. It's a transmission that has a long history, and if done right, can be it can be a life-changing experience.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Michael, would you like to open it up to some questions? Brother Arcee, if you could assist us with that.
Absolutely. So far, just a few comments in the chat, but we haven't had any questions yet. If you'd like to make a question, feel free to use the raise your hand option, the reaction in the Zoom chat or in the Zoom feature, or just chat to everyone that you have a question that you'd like to ask, and we'll unmute you and let you go. Our favorite, Right Worshipful Ponytail. He has a question to be asked. Go for it, Right Worshipful.
Yeah, first, thank you for bringing this out. I started trying to read Morals and Dogma, little bits and pieces of it long before I became a Mason. It was like that was a crazy rabbit hole to go down when you don't know anything about the ritual. But it did strike me. I've posted that section of page 12 where it basically reminds me of the Messiah in the temple, saying that you shouldn't be bowing down to the almighty dollar or lucre. And it seems to have been a universal message. What I find interesting is this was written at quite a turbulent time. Everybody always thinks of the Civil War, but I think there was greater turbulence thereafter, given what happened during Reconstruction, and I think he often struggled with his part in all that. I mean, these days you got people pissed off enough that they're pulling down his statue, but often don't you find that somebody that has been through the lightest and the darkest are the ones that often end up, as you said, what was it, apostolic? I can't even say apostolic succession. That you come to a certain revelation at a given point, and I think every time he in this chapter he seems to put himself in check a number of times, saying, "Oh, I'm not going to elaborate any further." And that's why I said earlier that's a teaser. That's like, I'm going to toss this out at you in the hopes that you look for it yourself. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Yet, on other aspects, he tells us what he thinks. And the interesting thing is, you look at the wording in there. Had you said that in the 50s, you'd probably have McCarthy after you. And it seems to be a theme that has been carried throughout. Like I descend from people who settled Perth Amboy and so on, and had an early set of actual operative Masons. And one of the things that they always did was, first thing was taking care of widows and orphans. So when people said that there was no such thing as a welfare state, yes, there was. But it was usually done through either the church, through whatever gathering they had, so that is a tradition. And that set of people seem to have that going up through Glen, New York, setting overseerships of poor and so on, and all the way out to Ann Arbor and beyond. So it has been in existence for the longest time here in this country. And I find it interesting of what he had himself entangled in, both before and after the Civil War.
Thank you, Right Worshipful. Our next question comes from Brother Terry Macarone.
Good evening, everybody, brothers. So earlier in the chat room, Brother Mitch, and just now to an extent, Brother Ponytail, mentioned the audience that Pike was speaking to, and the different the trials and tribulations that we were going through. And before that, the panel was discussing. I forget who it was that mentioned they were surprised that Pike started off with force here, when the first degree really relates to duty of God. And then we got into some esoteric and philosophical discussions with Brother Mike, not surprising, and if you know, kind of down that track. But I took a lot of this differently. And again, as I noted, I happen to have the Southern jurisdiction, so it's a bit deeper and harder to read, if that's possible. He starts off with blind force. Okay, that's what he's talking about, force. But he mentions that it needs to be governed by intellect. And then later on, he starts to relate that to politics. And I think that's kind of where we're going here. And there's a quote here in my copy: "The nations are not bodies politic alone, but also souls politic. And woe to that people which, seeking the material only, forget that it has a soul. Such a nation creates wealth rapidly and distributes it badly. Thence the two extremes of monstrous opulence and monstrous misery." Now, obviously, that applies to today. Look at what's going on in the world today. So it's very apt, but it also applies to what was going on at the time, and it translates. I mean, look at, it's like I said, very, very simple to see the examples today. But look at what he's coming out of: the Civil War, slavery, the South defending its right to own other people, losing their humanity by ownership because of the reaping the benefits of free labor and the money that it produces. So that really does translate from, 150 years ago to today. And he's warning us about losing ourselves. And it's, given today's society, somebody mentioned before about the partisanship, it's so relevant and needs to be brought out more. I think it's worthy of discussion.
So Terry, you think that he's talking maybe really not about politics at all, but maybe about the effect individual character has on society and governing a nation?
I think that it probably runs both ways. I think it's also the effect that society has individual character. Look at the people that sell their, you've got, teenage, 14, 15-year-old girls on TikTok half naked. I mean, what are they going to grow up to be? It's a scary process.
Well, I think the way that it works, and what you're saying is correct and plugs in precisely to what Michael said. It's all true. The problem is no one alive today has fully figured out how to responsibly interact with the internet, because we are animals that are evolved to deal with a tribe of at a maximum 200 individuals. And when we suddenly can telecommunicate with people from all over the world of any number, suddenly the lowest common denominator, which we would use to determine our norms, becomes extremely low. And so therefore you do get TikTok and people doing whatever it is that they feel is necessary to earn the approval of other people on TikTok. And because we have an international economy, like you mentioned before, where it became extreme focus of wealth and an extreme focus of misery, the marketplace used to be, regional. And then suddenly we had a Silk Road, and then suddenly we had shipping that would go from ocean to ocean. Now we can sell something from a home business over Etsy to somebody several countries away for the cost of just a little bit more in shipping. So we're all heaped together, all like 8 or so billion of us with access to the internet, in a way that we haven't ever been exposed to before. So our technology has outpaced our societal antibodies, our way to adapt to it sensibly. And obviously, anybody that has kind of had overexposure to the internet says, well, I just need to turn it off for a while. But you can't do that for a long enough time to become permanently sane, because you have to get drawn back into the ease of banking. And, oh, I just sent you that email. And did you see that meme that I sent you? It's something that is affecting the force that Pike was talking about in a way that's sort of unpredictable. And the thing that's kind of scary about it is the notion of, in every town of 200 people, all right, going back a couple of 100 years, there used to be 1 or 2 crazy people, right? And everyone knew who their name was or what their name was. And they said, oh, don't listen to that guy. He's off his rocker. And it was perfectly benign, because everyone knew who they were, and it wasn't something that was going to be dangerous. But now you don't know who's on the internet. Anybody could be anything. And all of these people that, want to really be right of whatever stripe, and it could be about anything. I'm not trying to pick on anyone in particular, have found other people that want to be right about whatever it is, all in the same way. And so now they're buoyed up by that force, that passionate, emotional force that needs to be checked by intellect. But the problem is not everyone can agree on what the intellect is. Everyone's in their own echo chamber. And that's what I think is the dangerous part of what Pike is bringing to light, and what is germane to society today. He was talking about the passionate force that we're all, simultaneously the source of, but also victim to, if we aren't very particular about watching what it is that we think, what it is that we feel, thinking about why we think and feel that, and trying to very meticulously police ourselves to make sure that our conscious thoughts are indeed our own, instead of something that is put there by someone else or by something else for its own ends. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Thank you, Brother Macaroni. Next, we're going to go over to, this should be a good one. He might be the youngest, but I know he is one of the newest Master Masons that we have tonight in attendance, Brother Short.
Thank you, Brother Arce, and thank you, brethren on the panel. What a wonderful conversation. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to narrow it down to Pike presents this passage that Masonry has its Decalogue, which is a law to its initiates. And these are its 10 commandments. And he goes on to list these said 10 commandments of the Decalogue. I'm wondering if any of you know where he's getting this Decalogue from, if this is something that he's creating specifically for the craft, just kind of pulling from bits and pieces here and there, or is he referencing some older source material?
Let me look it up specifically. In the Art de Hoyos version of this for the Southern Masonic jurisdiction, he mentioned it in the footnotes when I read that version. And I believe he said, let me just check here, 67.
It's from Commandments of the Ancient Sages in Raybould History of Freemasonry in Europe.
I have it if you.
And he said
Commandments.
the statement is misleading, even if well-intentioned. Freemasonry has never had a prescribed Decalogue, 10 Commandments, nor has this list been distributed within lodges. And as was mentioned, Pike referenced Commandments of the Ancient Sages. So it sounds like it was something that Pike assembled and put into his own writing, not having a Masonic source for it.
It looks like it's his actual commentary on the actual 10 Commandments, just rewording it according to the way he sees it.
Mhm. But as far as we know, it was never an official part of the first degree.
Yes, that's how I read the research that was done around it.
Mhm. Cool. I guess if we have time for another question, it seems to me that the unregulated force that he's speaking about in this lecture pays more mind to the gavel than it does to the 24-inch gauge. But when we look at England and Scotland's working tools, when we look at like the working tools of the older traditions, the gavel and the chisel are both much more intellectual working tools. So my question is, how do you guys see this lecture pertaining to the 24-inch gauge? Because it seems pretty evident how it fits with the work of the gavel. Or do you think he's trying to stretch a little far with this?
I don't want to take up all the oxygen, so I'm going to let Cliff answer first if he wants to.
I'm not sure how I feel about that, but you can go first, Walter. That's quite all right.
Okay. My exposure to the 24-inch gauge and common gavel versus that of the chisel is one where the gavel does call to mind force, but in the context that I was initially exposed to it, it's force used to eliminate things that are unnecessary. The 24-inch gauge, however, is a tool used to make things practical and efficient. And what I've discovered is that there is an ocean of things that you would describe as morally wholesome just by attempting to address things that are efficient. So if you take the notion of the 24-inch gauge, and I don't think that we're revealing anything too deep to say that, well, we're looking at time here. All right. And I try to explain this to my daughter, who is, she just turned 6, that there's only so much time to do anything. And if we want to enjoy the things that we enjoy, in order to be sensible about it, we need to find a place where that can fit in our day and think about how we get everything else done so that we're not ruining what it is that we want to enjoy by discovering that we forgot to shower, go to work, put on clean clothes, which is a very basic way of looking at it. But the point is that points to the intellect that Pike was talking about. When he was describing sort of that rude, unthoughtful force, the experience of parenting came to mind, where as you watch a human being developing from like, here I am, to something that you would recognize as a human being, they go through the stage of being just like passionate about whatever and having to attempt to learn how to think like it's a second language. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with intellectual capacity, because my daughter is extremely bright, but I have to tell her on a daily basis, you need to think things through. If you do this, what do you think will happen? And what I'm attempting to instill in her is a habit, which is a good thing to adopt no matter what age you are, of going through a thought experiment of, okay, I have this emotional drive to do this. What do I think is going to be the experience of it, and what are the consequences of it? And the further out I can figure out what the consequences of my actions will be, the more I've governed appropriately what it is that my emotions prompt me to do. So if I want to play a video game, all right, and I want to also have a happy wife, then I need to ensure that everything that she expects of me is already taken care of first, so that I am given license to truly enjoy this thing without having not only a consequence coming down the road that I'm not going to enjoy, but also the anxiety of, am I going to get away with this? The answer is no, never. So regardless of whether or not it's a 24-inch gauge or a chisel, the idea is that these two symbols are paired together to show you how they're supposed to work, to give you the elementary lesson of being a good man and starting to become better. Because not everybody learns how to appropriately govern your time. You know, I bought a book a couple of years ago called Tools of the Titans, and most of the unknown tools that billionaires have is having a counterbalance to that super productivity that we like to lionize. It's like, you need to have time to let your mind wander. You need to meditate and let your mind relax. You can't tense the muscle continuously. You need to be a whole person. You know, it's not just a matter of going all the way in one direction. You need to be able to do something and then come back to it, like rhythm, going back and forth between two pillars to walk between them. You see?
Right.
I think Walter is right. You know, I was at we did the School of Instruction last night, and I did a whole portion on the first degree. And I showed a video of a short video of Joseph Campbell. And he was talking about an event where a police officer was trying to save someone from jumping off a cliff. And he was holding on to him, and he would have went over if the other police officer didn't come around the other side to prevent them both. And he was saying that the story about this cop that risked his life for another, it's a breakthrough of a metaphysical realization that you and the other are not separate, and that its separation is only an effect of the temporal forms of sensibility of time and space, and true reality is in that unity with all life. That it is a metaphysical truth that becomes spontaneously realized because it's the real truth of our life. So we tied this in because when you're at the altar at the first degree and the master starts quoting the opening of the Bible, the first lines of Genesis, right? It's really talking about the creation of time and space. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, in which the illusion of separation comes into the soul. And so the first degree, among many things, teaches us with those tools how to actually realize that we're all in this together, whether it's the macro politics or it's on your own personal life or within your own heart and your own soul. So whether you're using a chisel or a gavel, I'm not sure it makes much of a difference as what the tool is actually telling us what to do.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Brother Short. We have time for our final two questions, the first of which comes from Brother Alessandro Gagliardi.
I feel like I'm bringing it down a notch by asking this question because that just conversation was so great. But there's a section in, I think it's on page 15, where Pike asserts that the letter that's supposed to be within the square compasses above the chair of the master should be a yod, or of course we're used to it being a G. And he argues that it shouldn't, a G only makes sense in English because it's supposed to refer to God, but it should be a yod because of Hebrew. But of course, in the second degree, we learn a whole different interpretation of the letter G. So I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about that kind of, I'd say, it seems like kind of a controversial and bold statement that Pike makes, that the letter should be yod.
Well, to appropriately respond, you have to sort of be versed in Kabbalah. So the yod traditionally is pointed to as an important letter because it's first in the Tetragrammaton, indicates fire and the world of creation. But the thing is it's more of an indication as to where to look, because looking deeper into the esoteric interpretation of Kabbalah as opposed to Kabbalah, this Kabbalah, as it has been explained to me, is the esoteric approach to it from a Western perspective. Kabbalah is a devotional practice done by people of the Jewish faith. From where I've learned, the point at the tip of the top of the yod indicates Godhead, like the great being whose consciousness underpins all of the cosmos. Anything more manifest than that is limited and thus an illusion, like, as Michael was referencing earlier. So that is probably where he was coming from, if anything that I study has anything to do with what the late 19th century esotericists were into. I happen to like the idea of using the letter on the inside as something that has room for reflection and swapping things out. For example, if you want to transliterate the G into a gimel and place that on the tree of life, that is oftentimes placed on the long path between Kether and Tifereth, which is the road from, crown of human consciousness straight up to the crown of creation. Probably not historically accurate, but I like it. It has sort of a nice ring to it. Does that answer your question?
And I think that, the yod makes a lot of sense, because if you study the Hebrew alphabet, all the letters of the alphabet contains a yod as its sort of, point of origin. All the letters have a yod placed in it somewhere in its design. And so the yod is a seed, if you will, perhaps a seed of creation, and certainly it's the seed that creates all the other letters of the alphabet.
That is really interesting, because I was just thinking to myself, no, I disagree with Pike, even though I don't have the authority to make that statement. But I kind of went with the Wilmhurst definition of what the G stands for. First of all, it stands for geometry, and then it only becomes God after you come out of the middle chamber. But it never ceases to be geometry, because he said the true meaning of geometry is geometry in Greek, which basically means the measurement of Earth. But when that science was developed, we didn't know that the Earth was a planet separate, and there was other planets in the solar system, and that the sun was a certain distance away. They saw the Earth as flat in the firmament, and there was lights in the sky and the sun, and everything was connected. So in reality, the geometry in ancient Greece was the study of reality. It was the precursor to philosophy. And so when you find out that it stands for G, for God, you realize that God and reality are not separate. But that's a different story. And if you come to that end, then what Cliff said, it makes perfect sense, because, and what Walter said, is that it's probably the same thing, the Yud and the G, if you understand its meaning. Fascinating.
Our final question of the evening tonight is going to come from Brother Christopher. And Brother Christopher, would you be so kind to help us with your last name?
Good evening. Yes, my name is Brother Christophe Lobry-Boulanger. I'm one of the AGLs from the 10th Manhattan District, which was mentioned before. And I'm very grateful to be attending this discussion tonight. Thank you very much, my partner, very worshipful Master Michael LaRocco, for the invitation a few days ago. Listening to this very interesting discussion, I couldn't help but noticing the few words talked earlier about the 24-inch gauge and the two working tools of the Entered Apprentice. And it's really, it's striking me always how one is a tool of action and the other one is a tool of measurement, to measure. Very similar to the tools discovered in the succeeding degrees, mostly the fellowcraft. Those are tools of measurement, not tools of action per se. And with regards to the 24-inch gauge, every time I either teach about it or have an explanation or have a discussion about it, I'm always reminded of the Greek concept, the two concepts of time that was used by the Greeks before. One was chronos, as you say, mostly in a quantitative definition of time, the 24 hours of the day, and divided in equal parts and so on. And we can measure time in this fashion, right? We spend 1 hour doing this, so we spend now a little bit over 1 hour together. And the second definition of times that the Greeks has was kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S, which was, on the other hand, a very qualitative definition of time. What is time made up with? What does it contain? What actually do we do with our time? And I was, I always have in mind this quote from Lenin, I believe, who said, sometimes decades pass and nothing happens, and sometimes weeks pass and decades happen. And so every time I think about the concept of time in a measuring way, I always encourage my brethren to make sure that not only they measure their time in a chronological sense, but also in a kairos, in a qualitative sense. That's all. Thank you. But thank you again for this very interesting discussion. I was very glad to be part of it tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for attending. We're going to hand things over to Right Worshipful Bill Edwards for your final thoughts on tonight's program.
I'd like to thank the panel participants tonight for joining us. Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us in. Brother LaRocco, if you could announce our next reading room that we have planned.
Yes, the next reading room will be on chapter 5 of Wilmhurst's book, The Meaning of Masonry. And I believe that we haven't set the date yet, but we'll be in the month of June.
Very good. Thank you. We'd like to go to our Deputy Grand Master for closing comments.
My brothers, what a wonderful evening. I want to thank you all. We are each on our own respective journey that doesn't change with the color of our aprons, the initials that precede our names, or the numbers that follow. Yet, too often, too much of our Masonic experience is consumed by the mundane yet necessary work of attending the business of our lodges. And while the social and charitable aspects of our craft are cherished parts of our tradition, they too can command an inordinate share of our time and efforts. But what of improving ourselves as men and Masons? There is an undeniable thirst in modern Freemasonry for esoteric knowledge entrusted to the care of our well-informed brethren. For as long as the craft has existed, brethren have gathered together within lodges when governed by thoughtful leadership, and certainly outside of their regular communications, to exchange Masonic ideas, thoughts, and insights. Craftsmen Online is here to foster that conversation. I am grateful for the wonderful work that Brother Michael Arce does each week on his outstanding podcast, engaging in Masonic discourse with Grand Masters, Sovereign Grand Commanders, Masonic educators and authors, entered apprentices, and everything in between. And I'm grateful for all of the unsung heroes of Craftsmen Online who work tirelessly on behalf of the craft. I want to thank our panel of distinguished scholars for such a thoughtful evening, headed by co-hosts Right Worshipful Bill Edwards and Very Worshipful Michael LaRocco, and our guests, illustrious and Right Worshipful Cliff Jacobs at 33rd and Right Worshipful Walter Cook. And I thank you, my brothers, for joining us this evening in our reading room, and urge you to continue your journey that never ends, but will assuredly inspire you along the way. But I ask you for a favor. Read the next chapter of the next reading room, because you will get so much more out of these wonderful conversations. Listen to our podcast and give Brother Arce 5 stars, because he deserves it. Like our Facebook page and subscribe to our website, craftsmenonline.com, where modern men explore the ancient mysteries. God bless you all, my brothers. God bless our craft. God bless our country.